Let's say if Trump is elected, it's possible he says to EM, you're fired, right?
Yep.
He's put up some trade barriers, put up some barriers to immigration, put up some barriers to investment outflows, or at least encourage reflows of investment to the United States and to other parts of the developed world. That could have a growth impact on global trade, global investment, and on emerging markets.
In this documentary, we focused on the investment risk that is posed by the emerging markets. Through this lens, we will show how the emerging markets do not actually add any additional investment risk to the global economy. Instead, they are actually considered by many investment professionals to be a great asset.
Emerging markets are much more unstable than the developed world. If you were investing in the last 40 years and you wanted to just be in the United States or just be in a couple of European countries, that was okay. But if you're investing primarily in emerging markets, the outcomes can be radically disparate and very quickly, which means you're going to have to take a lot more bets to have the same sort of type of risk profile. That's important to know, can be difficult to do.
The emerging markets consist of 5 different countries: Brazil, India, China, and Russia. An emerging market economy describes a nation's economy that is progressing towards becoming more advanced, usually by means of rapid growth and industrialization. These countries experience an expanding role in both the world's economy and on the political frontier.
When you say, well, why the emerging markets? They are the engine of global economic growth today. Their economies are growing faster than those in the developed world, countries like the US, Europe, and Japan. And they happen to have better fundamentals, better balance sheet fundamentals. That means that they're taking on less debt to grow their economies, and so that employs a different level of risk than you see in the developed world, where Europe has their debt problems, Japan has debt problems. And so that's a key characteristic, as well as the fact that they have much younger populations and very aspirational populations who are making less income than we do in the developed world, and they want to catch up, and I think many can and will catch up with us in the developed world over time.
Conclusion that the emerging market has positively impacted investment risk in the global economy. The first of these is GDP. GDP stands for Gross Domestic Product, and this is the monetary value of all the finished goods and services produced within a country's border in a specific time period. GDP can help to gauge a country's economic health. GDP is a comparison between the country's health and the overall market. If GDP is positive, it will boost the confidence of investors, thus making them more likely to invest in these countries. On the contrary, if GDP is negative, then this may be a huge warning sign to investors, which will make them more hesitant with investing in these emerging markets.
Goldman Sachs coined the term a decade ago to identify the world's fastest growing economies. It predicted the countries would be 4 of the top 6 economies by 2030. Through the first decade of this century, Goldman Sachs says BRIC countries accounted for over a quarter of the world's growth in gross domestic product.
The BRIC nations have kind of come under the scan over the last year or two. Growth rates have dropped quite significantly. India recorded a 5% GDP growth rate last quarter, slightly below that. Chinese growth, as we just said, has gone down a fair bit from the structural levels it was at 5 years back. Brazil, after hitting a very significant high in 2011, I think at 8%, has gone down significantly, down to about 2%. Same with Russia. Clearly, there are structural issues in the BRIC economies, and I think we are beginning to see some signs of these structural issues being addressed now. For example, the entire reform package in India over the last 3 or 4 months, the effort to reduce fiscal deficit, current account deficit, and not just pursue growth blindly. You've seen something similar in China as well. The new policymakers are not unduly worried about a headline GDP growth. Brazil also, they increase interest rates. They're sacrificing growth for a more stable and a more sustainable environment. So our sense is that it'll take time for these measures to flow through in the form of higher structural growth. But it seems to us that they are on a better track today than they were last year, when they were ignoring the structural challenges that the economies were facing.
have a listing of some of the things? It's a massive market with great potential. The reasons: there's strong GDP growth. The government is focusing on reforms, political stability, that move towards consumer services and goods. Here are reasons that you've presented. Tell us a little bit about how that translates into a strong investment opportunity in India.
Yeah, so at a time when globally we have seen that global growth is kind of weakening down, India is likely to grow at 7.5% GDP growth rate. In fact, the forecast for IMF says that India should grow that even next year. And that is primarily driven by the strong domestic market which is there. India GDP, 60% of the GDP contribution comes from domestic consumption. And domestic consumption is likely to receive a good boost this year because we have the 7th Pay Commission, which is going to increase the salaries for a lot of the government employees. And we had 2 years of pretty bad monsoons, and the forecast for this year is that the monsoon will be above average. So that should again boost rural consumption. So we have consumption likely to pick up going forward. And the government is putting a lot of focus on public investments in infrastructure.
4 countries in the emerging markets saw their GDP rise annually. In particular, China, whose GDP increased roughly 6 times since 2003.
We know in the last 10 years, Chinese GDP growth was amazing. 10% of historical peak is even higher than that. From this chart, you can tell. In 2007, GDP growth is close to 14%. It's almost unbelievable. Yeah, in the last 10 years, on average, GDP growth is around 10%. Yeah, we think it's too fast. I think everybody know it's unsustainable. Yeah, we agree with that. So I think the worst, I'm not talking about the worst case scenario. I think eventually, over the long term, in the next 5 or 10 years, China's GDP growth will slow down to 5%. But even 5%, I think is much better than 10% or 8%, because it's more healthy, more sustainable, and more balanced.
The second tool we will use to measure the positive effect of the emerging markets is the political stability of the countries. Politics highly affects the emerging markets and are indicators to investors on whether or not they should invest in a certain country. If a country's government is helping to push the growth and making the strides that are necessary to help the economy, this could be a very positive sign to investors that they would have the support of the government to back their investments. India, which has been a relative bright spot within the emerging markets since the election triumph of their Prime Minister Narendra Modi and his party in May 2014, politics has presented a small risk to India, realizing its potential as a high-growth market. India remains a star within the emerging market world. The third measurement is population growth of a country. Population growth can give investors insight onto whether or not to invest in these markets. All of the BRIC emerging markets have had consecutive quarters of good growth in population. Some of them, such as China and India, have seen large population growth over the last couple of years. These economies make up around 42% of the world's population, which is estimated to be higher than 7 billion. China and India in particular are highly populated. Respectively, they are the highest and the second highest population countries in the world. Out of every 8 people in the world, around 3 come from either India or China. All of the BRIC nations are characterized by the rising middle-class population and relatively young population compared to the developed world. Brazil has a median age of 30.7 years, while India's median age is around 27 years. Japan and Germany's median ages are higher at 46.1 years each. A young population means that there are more people working compared to a country with an older population. Also, a higher population means that there are more consumers. Consumption has driven India's economic growth for decades. China is now transitioning into a consumption-driven economy. The advantage of being a consumption-driven economy is reduced dependence on other economies' well-being for exports.
Who should consider political risk cover? And the answer is essentially every company with assets in emerging markets. Traditionally, it had been some of the extractive industries that had sought PRI cover. But over the past 20 years, with the wave of privatizations in several of the emerging market countries, as well as the corporate investment boom in EM, virtually every industry sector is now firmly invested in emerging markets. These sectors include food and beverage, telecoms and technology, hospitality, chemicals and pharmaceuticals, manufacturing, and even nonprofits. These are all industries that have exposure in emerging markets and exposure to political risk. So what are these risks? What should firms be concerned about? The first of which is political violence. And a scenario here is where a firm's, say, manufacturing plant or warehouse or sales office even, could suffer property damage from the likes of a revolution, a riot, war, civil war, a coup d'etat, an errant missile. And it's important to note that these risks are excluded under most PNC.
What's the problem with the emerging markets right now?
I think the emerging markets, I think of as the tail of the whip. So when you really believe that things have come together the way they need to, that's where the real leverage play is, because there's volatility, there's uncertainty. I think part of the issue for the emerging markets in general has been China. There's a lot of issues around China. Growth has decelerated. That was by design by the government because growth had gotten too frothy, and with that, concerns about inflation, et cetera. So we're now, the great debate is, will China grow at 7.5%, 7%, what is it? So China kind of drives, I think, the tenor of the whole emerging market. And as you said, I mean, we've seen some issues specific to other countries, and I just think all that makes people nervous. I believe when people get more convinced that the global trends will be what I described, that we are on a sustained move and it will be an accelerating growth rate globally, then I think more people will begin to move into the emerging markets as an investment.